They said I didn't belong. Imagine that. Standing in a room filled with people you love, the people you raised, the family you sacrificed everything for, and hearing the words, "You don't belong in the family photo, Grandma. Just take the picture." I stood there with the camera in my hand, my heart sinking lower than I thought it could. You'd think after a lifetime of giving, of late nights working, of saving every penny for their comfort, of holding back tears so they could smile, you'd think a mother, a grandmother, would be wanted in that picture. But I wasn't. My name is never in lights. My face rarely remembered. I'm the one behind the scenes, cooking, cleaning, sacrificing. But that day, something changed. I was invited, yes, but not really welcomed. Every smile felt forced. Every glance reminded me that I was only a guest in the very family I built with my own hands. And yet, what they said to me that day still echoes in my heart. They wanted me to take the picture. Instead, I took back something far greater, my respect, and I promise you, they never saw it coming. They called me a week before the gathering. My phone rang, and I froze for a moment, staring at the screen. It was my daughter, smiling through the speaker. Her voice, polite but restrained, carried just enough warmth to make it bearable. "Mom, we're having the family together this Sunday. You're invited," she said. Invited. Not welcomed, not wanted, just invited. The word echoed in my mind as I hung up. My heart fluttered with hope, but it was fragile. I remembered last year when the invitation came as a text. "You can come if you want, but try not to stay long." And this year, it felt the same, though wrapped in slightly softer tones. Even with the half-hearted invitation, I felt a spark that reminded me of what I had always wanted. To be seen, to belong, to have my place acknowledged at the very table I had helped shape over decades. I wanted to believe this time would be different. For the next few days, I couldn't sleep. I walked through my house, imagining the family gathering, imagining laughter, the warmth of shared stories, the small moments that make a family feel like a family. I went through the old photo albums, touched the worn edges of pictures where my grandchildren's baby smiles had frozen in time. I thought of my son, my daughter-in-law, the faces that sometimes felt so close, yet seemed so far away in reality. I decided I would go prepared, not just with my presence, but with my dignity intact. I opened my wardrobe and pulled out the dress I had been saving for a special occasion. A soft cream color, flowing, just enough shimmer to catch the light without screaming for attention. I wanted elegance, not extravagance. I wanted them to see me, the real me, the mother they had grown up with, the grandmother who had given everything silently, and maybe, just maybe, they would remember the love behind every meal, every folded shirt, every whispered word of comfort I had ever given. Beside the dress, I placed a small gift. It wasn't anything expensive, never had been, just a handcrafted vase I had painted, something delicate and thoughtful. My hands trembled as I wrapped it in soft tissue paper and tied it with a ribbon. I imagined their faces receiving it. Perhaps they'd smile. Perhaps they'd say, "Thank you," with a tone I could hardly read. But still, I hoped. Always I hoped. I spent that week rehearsing the conversation in my mind. I told myself I wouldn't complain if they dismissed me. I wouldn't show disappointment if they looked at me like I was invisible. But my heart longed for acceptance. I wanted to walk in the door and feel, for just a fleeting moment, that I was truly part of something bigger than myself. The day finally arrived. I woke early, making my usual breakfast, though I barely tasted it. My stomach was tight with anticipation. I combed my hair slowly, smoothing down the strands that refused to behave, adjusting my dress for the 100th time, making sure it fell perfectly, the hem just grazing my ankles. I picked up my little gift, checked the ribbon, and breathed deeply. As I drove toward their house, the familiar streets seemed different. Each turn, each corner carried memories of laughter and arguments, holidays past, birthdays celebrated and forgotten. I felt the weight of time pressing on my shoulders, the years I had given without complaint, the sacrifices that went unnoticed, the quiet love that often felt invisible. Pulling into the driveway, I saw the car that belonged to my daughter-in-law. My heart skipped a beat. She was already there, already inside, orchestrating the gathering that was supposed to include me. I smiled, forcing the warmth I hoped to feel, and stepped out of the car, holding my gift like a fragile shield. I rang the doorbell, and I heard footsteps approaching. The door opened, and there they were, my son, smiling politely, and my daughter-in-law, her smile just tight enough to feel rehearsed. "Mom," my son said, "we're glad you could make it." I nodded, holding my breath. "I wouldn't miss it," I said softly, almost whispering, but loud enough for them to hear. Inside, the house smelled like fresh bread and roasted chicken, scents that should have welcomed me, but today felt like a reminder that I was still an outsider in my own family. I followed them into the living room, where my grandchildren played quietly. Their eyes lit up when they saw me, a small flicker of joy, innocent and real. I wanted to capture that moment, to hold on to it, to remember that at least some of them saw me, truly. As I set my gift on the table, I noticed the subtle glances, the small adjustments in seating, the careful avoidance of my gaze. Half-hearted warmth, that phrase ran through my mind again. Half-heartedly invited. That's exactly how it felt, and yet I couldn't let that steal my anticipation, couldn't let it steal my dignity. I straightened my dress, smoothed the ribbon on the gift, and took a deep breath. I would be the mother and grandmother I always had been, quiet but proud, gentle but strong. I would step into the room with hope, even if they tried to dim it. That evening, every step toward their gathering felt like a test of courage. Every smile I gave was carefully measured. Every word I spoke weighed for impact. I wanted them to see me not as the quiet background figure, the grandmother who waits silently in the corner, but as the woman who had given everything without expectation of return. Little did I know, this invitation, this half-hearted, conditional invitation, would be the beginning of a story that would challenge them, shock them, and in the end, force them to recognize me in a way they never had before. And as I entered that house, gift in hand, heart full of hope, I didn't just step across the threshold. I stepped into a moment where my voice, my presence, and my dignity would demand to be seen. Because no matter what they thought, no matter how small they tried to make me feel, I was still here. I belonged. And this was only the beginning, mother speaking in first person, calm and reflective tone. The moment I stepped through the door, I knew something had changed. The air felt different, not warmer, not lighter, but colder, as if it carried the weight of all the unspoken words that had built up over the years. I could sense the shift immediately, the subtle tension lurking in every corner. I had imagined this moment countless times. I pictured the room bathed in laughter, the smells of home-cooked food inviting me in, grandchildren running to hug me, smiles all around. But reality was different. The air seemed stiff, rehearsed, almost artificial. It was as though everyone was performing some carefully written part in a play. And I, the mother, the grandmother, had been given a role in the wings, barely noticed. I stepped inside and was greeted with a smile from my daughter-in-law. It was polite, yes, but there was something rehearsed in it, something that felt like a mask she had practiced in the mirror. My son nodded at me, a brief lift of his eyebrows, a small acknowledgement that said, "You're here, but tread carefully." I moved further into the room, and that's when I noticed it. the subtle looks exchanged between them, the barely audible whispers when they thought I wasn't listening. A flicker of a smirk on my daughter-in-law's face, a glance from my son that quickly turned away, as if admitting that I was present might somehow disrupt their carefully crafted dynamic. They directed me to a chair at the side, slightly away from the main table. I felt the difference in energy immediately. The seat I had been given wasn't just a chair. It was a reminder of my place. At the edge, on the periphery. I smiled when I sat down, my lips curving outward politely, but inside I felt small. I felt diminished in a way I hadn't felt in years, like a quiet shadow lingering behind the brighter lights of their world. Even the room itself seemed to conspire in their subtle exclusion. The lighting was bright, but it cast strange shadows across the table, emphasizing the distance between me and the rest of the family. The table was set beautifully, yet every plate, every glass seemed arranged to remind me that I was not at the center of this gathering. I was merely tolerated. I watched my grandchildren chatter happily, oblivious to the tension around them. Their laughter should have been comforting, should have reminded me of the joy of being with family. Instead, it only sharpened my awareness of how small I felt. Even my presence, meant to be a source of warmth, was barely noticed. I tried to focus on the positive. I reminded myself that I had prepared carefully, dressed elegantly, and brought a gift that symbolized thoughtfulness and love. Perhaps it would speak louder than words. Perhaps it would remind them of who I was, beyond the sidelines. But as I placed the small vase on the table, I caught a sideways glance from my daughter-in-law. A subtle roll of the eyes, quick and almost imperceptible, but enough to sting. Every whisper, every glance, every barely audible comment was a reminder. I was present, yes, but I was not fully welcome. The coldness wasn't overt, it wasn't dramatic or loud. It was the sort of thing that seeps under your skin, that makes you question your worth, that makes you second-guess the hours and years you have devoted to a family who seems to treat your presence as optional. And yet, I held my composure. I smiled. I made light conversation where I could, asked gentle questions to my grandchildren, complimented the table setting, and offered to help in the kitchen. My outward demeanor was calm, reflective, warm even. But inside, I felt small. Every polite nod, every carefully measured word was a shield against the creeping disappointment I felt at being subtly pushed aside. At one point, I noticed a whisper pass between my son and his wife. I couldn't catch all the words, but I caught enough. Their tone, quiet, hushed, almost conspiratorial, carried a twinge of amusement. Something about me, it seemed, was a source of mild irritation, or perhaps inconvenience. I swallowed hard, forcing a polite smile to cover the flutter of hurt inside my chest. I reminded myself that appearances matter. They needed to see me composed, dignified, unaffected. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me falter. I would not retreat to the shadows, not yet. And so I sat, shoulders straight, smile in place, quietly observing every movement, every glance, every whispered exchange that tried to exclude me from the warmth of the room. Even the way my seat was positioned reminded me of their careful orchestration. It wasn't just to the side. It was slightly behind, angled just enough to keep me visible, but never central. I could see everyone else clearly, sharing jokes, making plans, leaning toward one another as they passed plates and poured drinks. I was at the periphery, yet fully aware of their interactions. I looked at my son, hoping for a brief moment of acknowledgement, a flicker of recognition that I had spent a lifetime supporting him, guiding him, loving him. But his gaze passed over me, polite but distant, attentive to the others, leaving me with the unmistakable clarity that, in that room, I was secondary. And still, I stayed. I smiled. I held my head high, even as a quiet ache settled in my chest. Every glance that avoided me, every subtle gesture that reminded me of my place at the edge, only strengthened my resolve. I wasn't going to let their cold welcome define me. I wasn't going to shrink. I wasn't going to leave before my moment, because I had learned long ago that dignity is maintained in the face of indifference, that self-respect isn't given, it's claimed. And even as the room's chill wrapped itself around me, I reminded myself I was present. I was part of this family, and one day they would have no choice but to see me, fully and unmistakably. So I smiled. I made small talk. I complimented the table. I listened to the laughter, the whispers, the half-hearted jokes. I held myself with grace, even as my heart whispered that I felt small. And in that quiet moment, seated at the edge of a room that pretended not to notice me, I began to plan, because I knew, deep down, this was only the beginning. The cold welcome, the whispered comments, the subtle exclusions, they had set the stage. And when the time came, I would step forward, not just into the room, but into my rightful place, and they would not forget it. Mother speaking in first person, calm, reflective, with rising emotional tension. Dinner had been served, yet it felt more like a performance than a shared family meal. The aroma of roasted chicken and seasoned vegetables should have wrapped me in warmth, but it didn't. Instead, every bite, every passing plate reminded me that I was on the outside looking in. I sat at the end of the table, my chair slightly angled away from the center of conversation. My son and his wife occupied the prime spots, the ones closest to the food, closest to the laughter. My grandchildren were tucked between them, passing plates and telling jokes that I could barely hear over the hum of polite conversation. Every word they shared seemed to skip over me, landing somewhere else, leaving me an observer rather than a participant. I tried to join in, of course. I smiled when they smiled, laughed when they laughed, offering gentle comments and soft chuckles in the spaces where I could find them. But the truth was brutal and immediate. No one looked my way. The laughter circled, the stories unfolded, the jokes landed, and I remained invisible. My son was distracted, his attention constantly drawn to his phone or to some whispered conversation with his wife. I reminded myself, perhaps he's busy, perhaps he's preoccupied with something important. But the quiet sting of neglect persisted. Every glance he spared me was brief, polite, and quickly turned elsewhere, as if acknowledging me took too much effort. My daughter-in-law, on the other hand, was effortlessly dismissive. Her comments to me were clipped, courteous, but distant. She leaned toward my son when speaking, gesturing toward him with subtle emphasis, creating invisible walls that I couldn't cross. I felt the careful orchestration, the way she controlled the flow of conversation, leaving me in pauses where my voice struggled to fill the silence. Even my grandchildren, who I loved more than life itself, were caught in the current of exclusion. They laughed at jokes that passed over me, whispered among themselves, and leaned into conversations that never invited me in. Their innocence did not spare me from feeling small, a reminder that even those who are too young to understand can mimic the subtle dynamics they see modeled by their parents. I remembered the vase I had brought, sitting delicately on the table. It was meant as a symbol of thoughtfulness, of love, of effort. But as I glanced at it now, it seemed to underscore my invisibility. It was acknowledged, only in passing, if at all, swept aside for practical matters or small adjustments to the table setting. I realized then that my presence, like my gift, was tolerated rather than celebrated. I forced myself to stay composed. Every polite smile, every gentle nod, every careful word of conversation was a small act of defiance. I refused to let the coldness around me dictate my dignity. And yet, The ache inside me grew. I laughed when they laughed, but the truth was unavoidable. I was not seen. Not really. My presence, my years of care and sacrifice, my heart and hands, all invisible in the hum of polite, practiced interaction. The conversation flowed around me like a river I could not step into. My son spoke about work, about the house, about plans that seemed to exclude me at every turn. My daughter-in-law added small jokes, light commentary, yet always directed toward him or the children, never toward me. Even simple questions like, "Mom, how was your week?" felt rote, obligatory, lacking warmth. I answered with care, with interest, hoping to bridge the distance, but the effort felt one-sided. At one point, my son chuckled at something my daughter-in-law said. I tried to laugh along, a soft, melodic laugh meant to blend, to connect, to remind them of my presence. I could hear my own voice, quiet but steady, yet it didn't seem to land. They didn't turn to me, didn't glance in my direction, didn't offer that small acknowledgement that could have made all the difference. I smiled for myself, for the dignity of remaining composed, but inside I felt a hollow ache. I looked at my grandchildren again, seeing the flickers of mischief in their eyes, the subtle interactions they had with their parents. My heart ached to join them fully, to be part of their laughter, to be the grandmother I had dreamed of being in these moments. Instead, I observed, quietly, silently, holding the space I had always occupied, supportive, loving, and yet largely unnoticed. Even the food, the meals I had dreamed of sharing together, became a reminder of my peripheral role. Plates passed, wine poured, conversations flowing, and I sat at the edge, participating in form, not in spirit. The laughter swirled around me, jokes landed in others' laps, and I found myself laughing too, not for the humor, but because it was the only way to remind myself that I still belonged in some small way. The silence between exchanges was deafening. Every pause in conversation reminded me that my words were not eagerly anticipated. Every glance away was a quiet assertion. You are here, but you are not central. I clenched my hands lightly under the table, forcing myself to sit tall, to breathe evenly, to maintain a calm exterior. Inside, a storm of hurt and determination churned. I reminded myself that I had come prepared for politeness, for patience, for perseverance. I reminded myself that dignity is measured not by others' acknowledgement, but by my ability to hold my head high, to remain composed when overlooked. And yet, even as I embraced that truth, I could not ignore the sting of exclusion, the cold tension that hung in the air like an invisible curtain. Throughout the meal, I tried again and again to contribute, to participate, to be seen. I asked questions of my son, commenting gently on his work. I complimented the food, asked about the children's activities, shared small stories from my own week, polite, measured, heartfelt. Each effort met with nods, brief smiles, and polite acknowledgments, but never the warmth I craved. I laughed when they laughed. I nodded when they nodded. I smiled when they smiled. And yet, I was painfully aware of the invisible barrier, the unspoken distance that separated me from the heart of the gathering. It was a quiet exclusion, subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but to me, it was clear as day. By the end of dinner, I realized that my presence had been tolerated, but not embraced. My attempts at connection had been met with polite acknowledgement, not engagement. My heart was heavy, but my resolve strengthened. I knew that this tension, this coldness, was not permanent. It was a symptom of the imbalance in respect and recognition that had existed for years. I forced a final smile, thanked my daughter-in-law for the meal, and offered to help clear the table. Even in their dismissiveness, I maintained my composure. I reminded myself that I would not shrink, I would not retreat. I would endure, observe, and wait for the moment when my presence would no longer be ignored, when my voice would be heard, when respect could no longer be denied, because I knew, deep down, that this tension, this cold, subtle, polite exclusion, was only temporary, and when the moment came, they would see me not as a shadow at the edge of their gathering, but as the mother and grandmother who had always been there, quietly holding everything together. I laughed when they laughed. I smiled when they smiled. And all the while, I planned, silently, carefully, for the day I would step fully into the light. Mother speaking in first person, calm but heavy, slow narration to build tension. The laughter around the table had quieted for just a moment, leaving the clink of cutlery and the soft hum of conversation to fill the spaces between. I had been telling a small story about a memory from when my children were little, a story meant to be gentle, reflective, a glimpse into the life I had devoted to them. I spoke slowly, carefully, savoring the words, hoping that they might catch the warmth I had tried to infuse. And then I heard it. It was barely audible at first, almost lost in the hum of voices, but it carried with it the sharp edge of disdain, cutting through the soft background like a knife. Why is she even still here? I froze. My hands tightened slightly around my fork, knuckles whitening. I could feel the sudden drop in my chest, that familiar sinking sensation of invisibility turning into outright rejection. Every ounce of warmth I had carried into that room felt as though it had been stripped away in an instant. It was my son, or maybe my daughter-in-law. I couldn't tell exactly who had spoken, and perhaps that was intentional. The words were soft enough to suggest they hadn't wanted me to hear, yet loud enough that I could. And here I did. Every syllable seared into my memory like fire on skin. I held back tears. That moment demanded composure. I reminded myself to breathe slowly, deliberately, as if each breath could steady the trembling inside me. I straightened my shoulders, lifted my chin, and smiled, carefully, deliberately, because if I faltered, if I showed the depth of my hurt, I would give them exactly the satisfaction they were seeking. I smiled, but inside, I felt a hollow ache, a mixture of disbelief, sorrow, and an almost primal sense of injustice. How could the family I had nurtured, the people whose every step I had supported, speak of me as if I were a stranger, a guest, unwanted in my own home? The words repeated in my mind over and over, growing heavier with each thought. Why is she even still here? I took a slow sip of water, trying to anchor myself. My fingers traced the edge of my glass, finding comfort in the cool smoothness, in the tangible presence of something real, something solid in a room that had suddenly felt alien. I glanced at my son. He spoke to his wife, leaning in just slightly, his voice low and casual, yet dripping with the weight of that remark. My daughter-in-law nodded, a subtle tightening of her lips, not a smile, not acknowledgement, just recognition that we were in agreement. I felt my chest tighten, my heart hammering quietly behind the composed exterior I had built. No one else noticed, of course. The children continued with their small chatter, oblivious to the cruelty that had just passed between the adults. But I could feel the sting of their words, like a cold wind across bare skin, a reminder of just how tenuous my place in this family truly was. I reminded myself to remain calm. I told myself that dignity is maintained not by the recognition of others, but by the strength to endure when faced with disrespect. I straightened my back, smiled at a fleeting moment in the conversation, and contributed another gentle remark to the table. My voice was steady, slow, deliberate, betraying none of the tempest inside. Yet the tension had settled into the room like a shadow, invisible to anyone who didn't know its weight, but undeniable to me. Every glance, every smile, Every laugh now felt tainted by that whisper, that quiet declaration that I was somehow superfluous, unnecessary, a presence tolerated rather than welcomed. I caught my reflection in a glass of wine, my eyes shimmering with unspent emotion, and I swallowed hard. I reminded myself, composure first, strategy second. Tears could wait. Anger could wait. But I would remember. Oh, I would remember every word, every glance, every subtle attempt to diminish me, and I would not forget when the time came to reclaim my place. The room continued to hum with polite conversation, yet for me, time seemed to stretch. Each passing second was heavy, filled with the echoes of that cutting remark. I replayed it in my mind, dissecting the tone, the inflection, the subtle cruelty hidden in its casual delivery. It was the kind of remark that could go unnoticed by others, dismissed as careless, but I knew it for what it was, a deliberate attempt to belittle, to erase, to remind me of my supposed place at the edge. And yet, beneath the hurt, beneath the quiet ache of exclusion, a small flame flickered. It was a quiet, resolute determination that whispered, "They cannot diminish me. I will not shrink. I will not fade into the shadows." I held my fork lightly in my hand, resting my elbow on the table, maintaining a composed exterior. Even as my thoughts roared inside, I traced the intricate patterns of the tablecloth with my eyes, grounding myself in small details, reminding myself of the strength I carried quietly, the years of patience, love, and care that had built this family in ways they may have never acknowledged. I laughed when they laughed. I smiled when they smiled. I answered questions when asked, spoke gently to my grandchildren, complimented the food and the arrangement of the table. All the while, I stored the memory of that whisper, letting it settle into a quiet corner of my mind. Because whispers like that do not break me, they sharpen me. They demand attention, force reflection, and ignite the fire of resolve. I reminded myself that respect is not given lightly, and those who forget it too easily will eventually be reminded. I took a deep, deliberate breath. The room continued its casual chatter, the air still heavy with invisible tension, the family unaware of the storm that had just passed between words. I felt my heart slow, my mind settle, and I made a quiet promise to myself. This is not the end. One day, they will see me for who I truly am. One day, I will step into the space I have earned. One day, they will not whisper, but watch me stand tall. The whisper had been cruel, sharp, a deliberate reminder of my place, or at least the place they thought I should occupy. But as I lifted my chin, adjusted my shoulders, and smiled once more, I knew that this was only the beginning. That quiet, cutting question, "Why is she even still here?" had lit something inside me, a quiet, relentless fire that would not be ignored. And in that moment, seated at the edge of a table where laughter flowed around me, I felt the unmistakable stirrings of the courage I would need, the courage to step forward, to demand not just attention, but respect, to show them, in no uncertain terms, that I belonged. Not in whispers, not at the edge, but fully, completely, undeniably. Because they could whisper, they could glance, they could dismiss, but they could not erase me. Not now, not ever. Mother speaking in first person, calm yet gradually building tension, reflective but poised. The meal had wound down, though the echoes of subtle tension lingered in the air like a stubborn fog. The children were finished with their plates, the adults fidgeted with napkins, and somewhere someone suggested it, the family photo. At first, I thought it was routine, a simple, harmless tradition, a moment to capture smiles frozen in time. I expected warmth, perhaps a fleeting inclusion, but what unfolded instead carved itself into my memory. "Everyone, gather around," my daughter-in-law called, her voice clipped but cheerful. I rose, carefully smoothing the folds of my dress, holding my head high as I prepared to move toward the cluster of family members arranging themselves for the photo. And then I heard it. A remark, deliberate and cutting. "You don't belong in the family photo, Grandma. Just take the picture." The words fell like stones into a quiet pond, sending ripples of shock and hurt through my entire being. My heart sank, dropping into a hollow pit I thought I had learned to navigate, but my mind sharpened immediately. I froze for a moment, as if the world had stopped spinning, just long enough for me to measure the weight of their cruelty. The camera hovered on a tripod, the phone ready to capture smiles, laughter, and memories that were meant to last forever. And they intended to do it without me, to render me invisible, to erase the years I had devoted to this family from the memory of a single frame. I looked at my son, expecting hesitation, an apology, a spark of guilt. Instead, his gaze flicked briefly to me, neutral, distracted, then returned to the others. My daughter-in-law's expression was calm, almost pleased, as if she had already won some small, unspoken victory. The children, unaware of the tension vibrating like a hidden current through the room, giggled and jockeyed for position, completely oblivious to the undercurrents of exclusion. I saw the smallest of them, my youngest grandson, glance at me with curiosity, sensing perhaps the shadow of unease, and it tugged at my heart. For a long moment I stayed still. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I let the words settle, let them echo in the silent space between breaths. My chest felt tight, the sting of rejection sharp and immediate, but with that pain came clarity. This wasn't just a remark. This wasn't a slight to be endured quietly, a slight to be tucked away beneath polite smiles and gentle nods. This was a challenge, a defining moment that demanded response, and I knew, in that quiet, aching space of realization, that the turning point had begun. I drew a slow, steadying breath. My eyes swept over the room, taking in every subtle glance, every whispered word, every posture that had for weeks hinted at exclusion. I thought of all the years I had given, the sleepless nights, the careful guidance, the sacrifices unnoticed, uncelebrated, and I made a choice. I would not shrink. I would not step aside. I would not allow my presence to be diminished in the very family I had nurtured. I straightened my shoulders, lifted my chin, and stepped forward. Slowly, deliberately, each footfall measured, each movement a declaration of dignity. The cluster of family members paused just slightly, sensing the shift in the air, though they couldn't have known its depth. I reached the center of the room, holding my head high, maintaining the calm composure I had trained myself to carry, even in moments of humiliation. Their plan, their quiet exclusion, was failing. I could feel the subtle shift in energy, the tension threading through the gathered group like electricity. I smiled softly, but with strength, not a timid smile, not one that sought approval, a smile that carried the weight of years, a smile that announced, "I am here, I have always been here, and I will not be erased." The camera remained pointed, ready to click, but now the balance had changed. The room's invisible hierarchy, the careful positioning, the whispered agreements, the subtle gestures that had relegated me to the sidelines, began to wobble under the weight of my presence. I felt a rush of quiet triumph, a surge of control over my own story. In that moment, I wasn't just a grandmother, a mother, or an invited guest. I was a force to be acknowledged, a presence that demanded attention without arrogance, without confrontation, without anger. Only dignity, only resolve. I could see the faint flickers of surprise on their faces. My son's eyes widened slightly, perhaps registering the quiet power in my posture. My daughter-in-law's lips pressed together, the smallest hint of discomfort betraying her careful planning. And the children, oblivious to the full weight of the situation, watched curiously, sensing only that something important was happening. I adjusted my position slightly, stepping into the center of the group, and the space that had been denied me became mine by choice. I did not speak. Words were not necessary yet. The act itself, the simple, deliberate presence in the space they had tried to exclude me from, was a statement that could not be ignored. And as the camera lens focused, ready to capture smiles, laughter, and what should have been ordinary memories, I realized something profound. This photograph, this single moment, was more than a picture. It was the first step in reclaiming my voice, my dignity, and my place in the family. I could feel the shift in my own heart. The hurt from the cutting remark still lingered, sharp as glass, but it no longer held me captive. Instead, it propelled me forward, sharpening my mind, strengthening my resolve. They had intended to silence me, to relegate me to the edge. But in that instant, I had chosen differently. I smiled again, this time fully aware of the power in my composure. I was seen. I was present. I was no longer merely a peripheral figure tolerated at the edges of their family dynamic. I had stepped fully into the frame, and in doing so, I had begun to rewrite the story, not with words yet, not with confrontation, but with the undeniable authority of presence. And I knew, deep in my bones, that this was only the beginning. The turning point had arrived. Every glance, every whispered remark, every subtle act of exclusion would now meet the quiet force of a woman who refused to be invisible. Because I had stepped forward, I had claimed my place, and no one, not even the ones I had nurtured and loved, could take it away from me. The click of the camera seemed distant, almost irrelevant, as I held my pose, my head high, my smile steady. I could feel the shift around the room, the tension threading through their carefully constructed world. And in that moment, I realized something essential. I was no longer the quiet, overlooked figure. I was a mother, a grandmother, a woman with decades of love, sacrifice, and patience. And now I was undeniably here. The turning point had begun, and from this moment forward, everything would change. Mother speaking in first person, calm but resolute, slowly building tension to its peak. The air was heavy with unspoken words, the remnants of subtle cruelty lingering like a shadow over the room. The family had gathered, smiles carefully arranged, laughter flowing around me like a river I could not join. Or so they thought. The camera lens focused, poised to capture the carefully orchestrated image they wanted, one that excluded me, one that diminished my presence to a mere observer behind the frame. I felt the weight of their expectation pressing on my shoulders, a quiet insistence that I remain invisible, that I shrink into the shadows, that I accept my role at the edge. And yet, at that precise moment, a quiet fire ignited within me. Years of patience, of love, of unseen effort surged forward in a single, undeniable realization. I would not retreat. I would not step aside. I would not be invisible in the life I had built and nurtured. I took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the tension coil around me like a living thing. My heart raced. Yes, but not with fear, with courage, with clarity, with the unmistakable awareness that this was my moment to reclaim not just space, but respect. I moved forward, one step, then another, each step deliberate, steady, measured. The world seemed to slow, as if every small movement was magnified, every heartbeat amplified, every glance around the room sharpened by the weight of what was about to happen. I stepped into the center of the room, not hesitating, not faltering, carrying the invisible yet palpable strength of decades spent loving, sacrificing, and building this family. My smile remained calm, serene even, but my eyes held a quiet fire that betrayed the depth of my resolve. They had expected compliance. They had expected me to hover behind the camera, to record their laughter, to quietly approve from the sidelines. But in that instant, I refused. I refused to shrink. I refused to accept invisibility. I could feel every eye on me, though some dared not meet my gaze. My son's expression flickered. Surprise, hesitation, perhaps even guilt. My daughter-in-law's lips pressed tightly, her carefully rehearsed composure faltering under the unexpected assertion of my presence. The children, still unaware of the tension threading through the adults, glanced at me curiously, sensing only that something significant was unfolding. And then I fully stepped into the frame, not just the camera's frame, but into the heart of the family, the place I had earned, the place I had nurtured, the place I would not allow them to deny me any longer. I held my head high, shoulders squared, chin lifted. Every ounce of doubt, every whisper of past humiliation, every subtle attempt to diminish me was left behind in the shadows as I took my rightful place. I was no longer a peripheral figure, no longer a tolerated presence. I was here, I was seen, and I would not be erased. The tension in the room was palpable. You could feel it in the slight stiffening of bodies, the almost imperceptible shift in posture, the tiny flickers of surprise and unease that spread like ripples across the gathered family. The very air seemed charged with the sudden imbalance of power, the power of a woman who refused to be overlooked, who refused to accept being sidelined in the story she had helped write. I smiled gently, fully aware that this small act of courage, this simple step forward, carried more weight than any words I could speak. The silence around me was deafening, each pause punctuating the quiet authority I now embodied. I could feel the eyes of my family tracing me, measuring me, perhaps reassessing every subtle dynamic they had taken for granted. The children glanced back and forth, some with curiosity, some with uncertainty, sensing the tension, but not yet understanding its full significance. My son cleared his throat, perhaps searching for the words that might dissolve the moment. But there was no turning back now. I had claimed the space, and it was undeniable. I took another breath, slow, steady, grounding myself in the present. My heart pounded not from fear, but from the exhilaration of asserting my rightful place. Every fiber of my being was aligned with the knowledge that I was not just stepping into a photo. I was stepping into my own narrative, into the respect I had earned through years of patience, care, and unwavering love. The camera's lens remained focused, ready to click, but in that instant, I realized something profound. The photograph would capture more than smiles and faces. It would capture courage. It would capture dignity. It would capture the quiet, unyielding force of a woman who refused to be sidelined. I could feel the subtle cracks forming in the carefully constructed walls of exclusion. My son's eyes met mine briefly, a flicker of something unspoken passing between us. Perhaps recognition, perhaps guilt, perhaps dawning respect. My daughter-in-law's composure wavered, a tiny crease forming in her otherwise perfect posture, betraying the discomfort of realizing that her control over the narrative had been disrupted. And in that moment, I smiled fully, confidently, deliberately, not a timid smile, not a smile seeking approval, a smile that carried decades of resilience, of love, of endurance, and of the unwavering knowledge that I belonged. I had stepped in, not just into the frame, but into my place in this family. Every breath I took, every slight movement, every subtle expression broadcasted the truth that could no longer be ignored. I was present, I was integral, and I would no longer be pushed to the edges. The tension in the room reached its peak. You could feel it in the stillness, in the paused conversations, in the collective awareness that something had shifted irrevocably. The carefully maintained hierarchy of exclusion, of quiet dismissal, had been disrupted, and I stood at the center, calm yet resolute, embodying a quiet power that radiated without a single word spoken. For the first time that evening, the energy in the room acknowledged me. The invisible barriers of dismissal and subtle cruelty could no longer contain me. I had claimed not only the physical space, but the emotional and moral space that had long been denied me. I glanced briefly at my grandchildren, seeing the flicker of understanding in their eyes, sensing perhaps that they were witnessing more than a simple act of defiance, that they were witnessing the embodiment of dignity and courage, a lesson in self-respect that could not be taught with words alone. And then, as the camera finally clicked, capturing the moment in a frozen frame, I realized something essential. This photograph, this simple act of presence, would mark the beginning of change. It was not the culmination, but the turning point. I had stepped forward, and the world around me, the carefully constructed world of exclusion, whispers, and subtle cruelty, could no longer remain the same. The balance had shifted, the tension had peaked, and I had emerged, calm, composed, and undeniably present, ready for whatever came next, because from this moment forward, my voice, my presence, and my dignity could no longer be ignored. Mother speaking in first person, calm yet resolute, voice measured, building emotional intensity for the climax. I stood in the center of the room, the camera still poised, the echoes of the previous tension vibrating softly in the air. My body was calm, composed, but inside, every nerve hummed with the weight of the moment. I had taken my place physically, but now it was time to take my place emotionally, to step fully into the truth I had carried quietly for years. I drew a slow, deliberate breath, letting it ground me. My hands rested lightly at my sides, not trembling, not fidgeting. I looked around at the faces of my family, my son, my daughter-in-law, my grandchildren, each expression a mixture of curiosity, unease, and subtle tension. The room was still, holding its breath, sensing that something important was about to unfold. "I've stayed quiet for too long," I began, my voice calm but firm, each word deliberate, each syllable carrying the weight of decades of love and sacrifice. "I've watched, I've waited, and I've endured, not because I wanted to be invisible, but because I believed that love meant patience, that family meant tolerance, that being a mother and grandmother meant putting myself last." The silence in the room deepened, stretching taut, as if the air itself was holding its breath alongside them. I could feel the shift, subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable, that came from speaking truth instead of bending to polite expectation. "I came here hoping to be part of your lives," I continued, voice steady, calm, unwavering. "I prepared for today. I brought my best. I came with joy in my heart, and yet I have been met with whispers, dismissals, and reminders that I am somehow unnecessary. Why are you even still here? You don't belong in the family photo." Words like these have been said, and for a long time I swallowed my pain, smiled through it, and stayed quiet. But I can't do that anymore. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. I looked at my son. I looked at my daughter-in-law. I looked at my grandchildren, seeing both the innocence in their eyes and the reflection of the subtle tension that had grown over the years. I have sacrificed. I have loved. I have given endlessly, and I have done it quietly, without complaint, without demand, and without expectation. And yet, today, I see that my presence is still questioned, still belittled, still treated as something optional. My voice did not rise. It did not tremble. It did not carry anger, though the words themselves were cutting in their clarity. "I am here because I am your mother. I am here because I am your grandmother. I am here because I have always been, even when you didn't notice, even when you dismissed me, even when you whispered about me as though I were invisible." The room was silent. The children shifted uneasily, unsure of the gravity of the moment. My son's expression had changed from casual dismissal to quiet shock, his eyes widening slightly as he absorbed the years of effort and care that had gone unacknowledged. My daughter-in-law's lips pressed together, her composure faltering as the subtle authority in my voice demanded recognition. I am tired of being quiet when I have so much to say, I continued, my tone calm but resolute, my words measured and deliberate. I am tired of being treated as a shadow in my own family. I am tired of being told to step aside, to take the picture, to remain invisible while you occupy the center. I am here, fully, completely, undeniably, and I deserve to be acknowledged, to be respected, to be seen. The silence that followed was heavy, almost tangible. I could feel it pressing against my ears, settling in the corners of the room, a testament to the impact of speaking truth without fear. I saw the subtle flicker of realization on my son's face, the tightening of his jaw, the slow recognition of how his actions, or inactions, had affected someone he had always called mother. I took another breath, steady, deliberate, anchoring myself in the certainty of my own voice. I have given you everything I could. I have given you love, patience, guidance, and support. And I have done it without asking for anything in return, except acknowledgement, respect, and the simple dignity of being recognized as part of this family, not at the edges, not in whispers, but fully, completely, with presence and care. The children looked at me with wide eyes, sensing the depth of my words, even if they did not fully understand. My son remained silent, the weight of my voice pressing on him more than any confrontation ever could. My daughter-in-law's hands fidgeted slightly, a small but telling sign of discomfort and acknowledgement. I am not here to create conflict, I said, my voice calm, patient, and unwavering. I am here to reclaim the space that has always been mine. I am here to ensure that the love I have poured into this family is recognized. I am here to step out of the shadows and into the place I have earned through years of dedication and care. I let the words linger, letting the room absorb the gravity of what I had said. Every pause, every glance, every subtle shift in posture was a testament to the power of truth spoken calmly and firmly. This was not about anger. This was not about revenge. This was about acknowledgement, dignity, and the quiet assertion of a life that had been devoted selflessly to others. The air was thick with tension, the silence almost suffocating, yet beautiful in its weight. It was the moment when unspoken truths met the surface, when years of patience collided with the necessity of recognition. I could feel my own heartbeat steadying, my resolve deepening, my presence no longer merely tolerated, but undeniably commanding. I have loved you all without hesitation, I concluded, my voice softening but remaining firm. And now I ask only that you see me, truly see me, not as a guest, not as an obligation, not as someone optional, but as your mother, your grandmother, and as the person who has always been here, quietly, faithfully, and unconditionally. The room remained silent. The weight of my words hung in the air like a tangible presence. My son's eyes met mine, no longer casual or distracted, but wide and unguarded. My daughter-in-law's composure had cracked, if only slightly, betraying the impact of hearing what had been unsaid for so long. The children watched, curious and silent, witnessing a truth they had not been old enough to understand before, now laid bare in its full emotional power. And in that silence, I realized the profound beauty of what had just occurred. I had spoken my truth. I had revealed years of sacrifice, of love, of patience, of quiet endurance. I had given voice to the emotions that had been locked away, and in doing so, I had shifted the balance, not through anger or confrontation, but through calm, deliberate, unwavering presence. No one spoke. The room was still. Every gaze held mine. Every unspoken thought hovered between us, suspended in the tension I had created, not to punish, not to shame, but to illuminate the reality of my life, my love, and my unwavering commitment. And in that stillness, I felt a profound sense of closure and empowerment. The years of silence had ended. The quiet endurance had transformed into recognition. The emotional climax had arrived, not with shouting, not with conflict, but with the undeniable authority of truth, spoken calmly, firmly, and with love. I took one final, deliberate breath and allowed the silence to linger, knowing that this moment would be etched forever in our family's memory. For the first time in years, I had been fully seen, fully acknowledged, fully present. And in that presence, I realized the most powerful truth of all. Dignity, once claimed, can never be denied. Mother speaking in first person, calm, reflective, tone proud yet gentle. I stood for a moment, letting my words hang in the quiet room, letting the weight of what I had said settle over everyone. The camera had captured the smiles, the positions, the outward appearances, but it could never capture the truth, the clarity, the dignity I had claimed for myself. Then slowly I stepped back. My shoulders were straight, my head held high. Each step I took toward the door was deliberate, a quiet declaration of self-respect and inner strength. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that this movement, simple yet powerful, marked a profound shift in the dynamic we had lived with for far too long. I glanced at my son. He avoided my eyes, caught perhaps in the weight of his own conscience. My daughter-in-law lowered her head, unable or unwilling to meet mine, their subtle gestures betraying the recognition of the boundaries I had just drawn. The children watched silently, sensing the gravity of the moment, the solemnity that came not from anger, but from integrity. As I reached the doorway, I felt a quiet surge of pride. I had spoken my truth. I had reclaimed my place. I had stood firm without raising my voice, without dramatics, without seeking vengeance. And for the first time in a long while, I was fully seen, not as an obligation, not as a shadow, not as someone optional, but as the mother and grandmother I had always been. I paused, feeling the air shift around me, and allowed a soft, serene smile to settle on my face. My heart was calm, my mind was clear. I carried the unmistakable certainty that respect had been earned, that dignity had been restored. And with that, I spoke the words that summed up everything I had done, everything I had endured, and everything I had claimed for myself. They wanted me quiet. But at dessert, I served more than sweetness. I served respect. With that, I stepped out, leaving the room, leaving the whispers, leaving the tension behind, and walking into the quiet triumph of my own self-assured presence. The door closed softly behind me, but the impact of the moment, the assertion of truth, dignity, and respect lingered, echoing far beyond the walls of that room.